The uniform did not fit her precisely. The previous wearer had been broader through the shoulder and shorter at the hem, and so the gray wool hung a little loose at the collar and dragged half an inch against the stone floor as Cicely Wren moved through the corridor. She had turned up the cuffs herself, 3 careful folds, and pinned the cap so it sat level rather than listing to one side. It was the best she could manage in the 10 minutes she had between learning that Ellen Marsh was dead and stepping into her place. The servants' passage ran the length of Thornmere Hall's west wing, and at this hour of the morning, the only light came from the single tallow candle Cecily carried, the flame pressed against the darkness rather than pushing it back. She kept her breathing even. She kept her steps quiet. She thought about Ellen, who had been 23 years old, who had come to Cecily in the gardener's cottage 3 days ago, and sat across the small table with her hands folded around a teacup, and her voice dropped so low that Cecily had needed to lean forward to catch all of it. Ellen, who had said that something was not right with the wine service. Ellen, who had been found the next morning at the foot of the servants' stair, with a verdict of misfortune and no further inquiry ordered by anyone in the household. The door to the butler's pantry was slightly ajar. Through the gap, Cecily could see the long oak table, where the evening's decanters were lined in their tray, already filled. They caught the light in a way that should have been beautiful, those dark glass shoulders with the wine shining red-brown behind them. But everything in this house had begun to look like a question to her now, and the decanters were no exception. She stopped. She breathed. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. What she did not know yet was that the Earl of Thornmere himself stood at the end of the passage, watching her from the shadow. She had arrived at Thornmere 4 days ago as a companion to Lady Hargrove, whose late husband had been a distant cousin of the current Earl. It was not a position Cecily had sought in the ordinary sense of the word. It was a position she had constructed with a care that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as the clergyman's unmarried daughter from Lincolnshire, the young woman of 27, who had been left with a small stone cottage, an uncomfortable amount of intelligence, and a father's debts that had been settled only by the sale of everything in the house except his books and his papers. What her acquaintance in Lincolnshire did not know was that her father had spent 20 years before his ordination working as an investigator for a firm of London solicitors, and had spent the entirety of his subsequent life corresponding with the men he had worked alongside. What? Letters that accumulated in tied bundles on the upper shelves, and that Cecily had read from first to last when she was 17, and then reread with increasing comprehension in the years since. She had his eye for the small detail that sat in the wrong position. She had his patience for waiting. She had learned from his letters how a household reveals what it does not wish to. Ellen had written to her first. A single letter addressed through a mutual friend in the village describing what she had witnessed on 3 separate occasions in the past 2 months. A powdery substance added to the wine decanter in the butler's pantry before service. Always in the late evening, always when the butler himself had stepped away. Always administered by a hand that retreated quickly when the passage door moved. The Earl of Thornmere had grown more confused and unwell with each passing week. His cousin, Mr. Groda. Philip Vane had grown more certain, more comfortable, more quietly authoritative in his movements through the house, and in his conversations with the steward and with the solicitors who occasionally arrived from York. Ellen had not known what the powder was. She had known she was frightened, and she had known she had no recourse inside the house, and she had known from an old-school friendship that there was a woman in the village who might be willing to think about it. Now Ellen was dead, and Cecily was wearing her uniform, and his cousin was somewhere in the house above her. She set the candle on the table and reached into her apron pocket for the small glass vial the apothecary in Lincoln had given her, along with a written list of what it would indicate and how. She uncorked the nearest decanter and drew a careful measure, watching the liquids fall. She held the vial to the candle flame and observed what was there to observe, a step in the passage behind her. She corked the vial and slipped it back into her apron pocket in one movement, kept her back to the door, her hand shifting to the decanter as though she had been straightening the tray rather than testing its contents. "You are not the girl who works this passage," a voice said. It was low. It was entirely level, It did not sound like a man who had come upon something unexpected. It sounded like a man who had been watching long enough to confirm what he already suspected, and had now simply arrived at the point where he could say it aloud. Cecily turned. She had seen the Earl of Thornmere once before this moment, at a distance. In the entrance hall on the afternoon she and Lady Hargrove had arrived. He had seemed merely a tall man in dark clothes, who moved through his own house with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to a great deal of scrutiny, and who had made his peace with it. Up close, in the narrow doorway of the butler's pantry, with a single candle between them, he was something considerably more complicated than that impression had suggested. He was perhaps 34, with dark hair pushed back from a face that carried its tension in the jaw rather than in the eyes, and the eyes themselves were the gray of early morning sky before the light decides what color it will ultimately be. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, and decided not to try. "No, my lord," she said. "I am not." He said nothing. He looked at her hands, which were still, and at her face, which she kept composed, and then at the decanters behind her, on the table. "Then you will come with me," he said now. Not by the back stair. It was not a question, and it was barely even a command. It had the quality of a statement made by a man who has already completed the assessment and arrived at his conclusion, and is merely informing you of what the next minute will contain. She followed him. If you have followed a story this far in the early dark, come a little closer. There is more yet to reckon with, and it will ask something of you, before it gives you what you came for. The study was at the far end of the east wing, removed from the rest of the house by 2 locked doors that he opened with keys from his own coat pocket. He lit the lamp on the desk himself rather than calling for a servant, and in the steadier, warmer light of the lamp Cecily could see things she had not been able to see in the passage. He was thinner than a man of his height and frame should be, that there were shadows beneath his eyes of the particular quality that belongs to sustained illness rather than simple fatigue, and that his hands, when he set the lamp down, trembled for a fraction of a second before he stilled them with deliberate care against the edge of the desk. He had been drinking from the decanter for months. Whatever was in it had been working on him, and he had been working against what it was doing to him. And the contest had left its marks. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across the desk from him. He remained standing, which she suspected was partly because sitting required the admission that he needed to. "You are not a housemaid," he said. "No," she said. "You are Lady Hargrove's companion." "I arrived as such?" "Yes." "And before that position, before Lady Hargrove?" He looked at her steadily. "What are you?" It was a peculiar question, phrased in a peculiar way, and she thought about it for a moment rather than answering immediately, which seemed to neither alarm nor impress him. He was simply waiting, the way her father had described good interrogators waiting. Not with pressure, but with a quality of available attention that made silence less comfortable than speech. "My father was an investigator," she said. "Before he entered the church and after he stopped being young enough for the work to suit him. He kept all of his papers. I read them with perhaps more attention than he intended when he left them accessible on the upper shelves." Something happened in the Earl's face. It was very brief, and she would not have caught it, except that she was watching for exactly that kind of brevity, the small adjustments that faces make when they receive information they had not prepared a response for. It was not suspicion, it was not calculation, it was something that looked, very briefly, like the expression of a man who has been speaking a language in isolation for some time, and has just heard it in another person's mouth. "Ellen Marsh," he said. Her name was careful in his mouth. It had weight in it. "She wrote to me," Cecily said. "She had no other recourse. I was told her death was an accident." "I know, I do not believe it was." He pulled a chair from the corner of the study without taking his eyes from her, and sat, not with the ease of a man at leisure, but with the controlled economy of a man who needs to sit and is permitting himself to do so, because maintaining the opposite position is requiring too much. "My cousin," he said and stopped, and did not finish the sentence in the direction it had been going. "Philip Vane," she said. "Yes," He stands to inherit if you die without an heir. He is the next in the male line. Yes. Has he free access to the wine service? The Earl's jaw tightened in a way that was not anger, but something that lived in the same country. He has had the run of the house for as long as I have owned it. We were raised together. His mother and my father were. He stopped again. This particular stop was different from the preceding ones. It had the quality of a door held closed rather than a sentence that had simply run out of words. He said after a moment, "Only he was like a brother to me." I say it in the past tense because I have had rather too much time these past months to consider what the present tense of that sentence could now honestly be, and I have not arrived at a satisfactory answer. There it was. Not a cold man. Not a careless one. A man who had spent months growing unwell while trying to find an explanation that did not require him to believe the thing the evidence was most strongly suggesting, who had perhaps very nearly settled on an explanation that would have let him keep the brother he thought he had, if his body had cooperated a little longer. On the mantelpiece there was a painted likeness of a woman who shared his eyes, and something of the particular stillness his face carried in repose. The paint was old. The gold of the frame had the dullness of something that had been in the same room for decades and had absorbed the smoke and the time. He looked at it once during the silence that followed, briefly, and Cecily noted it, and filed it away. "The vial in my pocket," she said. "I drew a measure from the nearest decanter before you arrived in the passage. If you can procure an apothecary by morning, preferably one who has no existing relationship with your household, the substance can be identified and documented. I have a list of compounds that would produce the kind of gradual decline you appear to have been experiencing. The apothecary's assessment will tell us which we are dealing with." He looked at her for a long moment. "You planned this," he said. It was not an accusation. It had something at its edge that was almost wonder, the slightly disoriented quality of a man who has been solving a problem alone for months and has just discovered that someone else has been working on it from a different direction and has arrived further along. "She planned it first," Cecily said. "She came to me because she had no one else. I am here because she cannot be." The silence that followed, that was simply a silence. It asked for nothing and offered nothing, and just occupied the room with a quality she found she could sit inside without difficulty. He did not look at the painting again. He looked at his own hands for a moment, which had steadied, and then at the cap she still wore, slightly askew, and at the uniform that was not quite her size, and at the cord of the apron still tied at her waist over clothes that were not a maid's clothes. "Cicely Wren," he said at last. He had known her name from Lady Hargrove's introduction 4 days ago. In the entrance hall, though they had not exchanged more than the necessary pleasantries at the time. Her name was deliberate in his mouth now. She met his eyes and said nothing. "We will need a second witness," he said, "for what comes next. A legal authority, not merely a domestic one. Someone whose documentation cannot be questioned." "I had anticipated that," she said. "I wrote to a solicitor in York 6 days ago. He knew my father. He should arrive by the day after tomorrow if my letter reached him in good order." The Earl of Thornmere looked at her across the desk in the early morning of the East Wing study, with the lamp between them and the oil painting of his mother on the mantelpiece, and somewhere in the sleeping house above them, a man who had been poisoning his cup, and his face was doing something that was not quite readable, but that she had learned. In the hours since she had come into the house, as Lady Hargrove's companion was the expression he wore when he was turning an assessment over and finding it not what he expected. He said, "You are not what I expected Lady Hargrove to bring." "I imagine not," she said. She was not entirely certain what she was bringing either. "I was fairly specific in my letter about the kind of visit I thought would suit her." "How specific?" "I told her that the air of the North Riding would be beneficial to her constitution, and that the company at Thornmere would be congenial. Both of those things may yet prove true." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was very small, and it disappeared almost before it could be called anything. But it was not nothing. "Go back to your room," he said, and the instruction had the same quality as his earlier commands, direct, without apology, and carrying underneath it a care that had no name she wished to give it yet. "Sleep what hours remain. I will send word to Hesketh. He is a careful and discreet man, and he is not my cousin's doctor." She rose. She paused at the door. "The decanters," she said without turning back. "All of them. Not only the one I drew from. And the glasses should be rinsed before anyone drinks from them in the morning." A pause. "Yes," he said. "I had thought of that." She walked back to her room through the dark corridor, the tallow candle burning low in her hand, her footsteps quiet on the stone. The apothecary arrived before 7. A small, methodical man named Dr. Hesketh, who had the composed, careful manner of someone who had been informed of a serious matter before breakfast and had decided to treat it as simply another serious matter in a long professional life of serious matters. He set up his instruments on the study table while the Earl stood at the window and Cecily sat near the door with her hands in her lap, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing useful to say until Dr. Hesketh had said his part. The small instruments made small sounds against the glass. Dr. Hesketh worked in silence. Outside the study window, the autumn morning was coming up slowly. A thin, cold light edging along the grounds of the estate, touching the bare trees at the edge of the formal garden, catching the corner of the stone wall that surrounded the kitchen garden where Cecily had walked twice in the past 4 days to learn the physical geography of the house and its dependencies. "Antimony," Dr. Hesketh said. He did not look up from his instruments immediately. He made a note in his casebook first, in the careful small hand of a man who understands that documentation is the difference between a finding and a fact. Then he looked up. In a compound with 2 other substances designed to slow its visible effect, it is gradual in its action, which is both the point of it and the reason it is difficult to attribute with certainty without a deliberate test. The symptoms it produces over the course of several months are consistent with a number of ordinary ailments, particularly in a man who has been under strain or who has suffered a recent loss. Cecily kept her eyes on the middle distance. She had not known what the apothecary would find, only that there would be something to find. Knowing and finding were different experiences, and she was in the finding now, and she was not entirely prepared for how much heavier it sat. "Al!" "How long?" the Earl said from the window. He did not specify what he was asking because Dr. Hesketh did not require him to. At the rate of the compound in the sample, and assuming the exposure had been continuing for the time period you have described, I would estimate that another 6 to 8 weeks of sustained ingestion would have produced an acute episode from which recovery would have been unlikely. He paused for a second, in the way of a careful man ensuring his next sentence is also a careful one. "As matters stand, the exposure has been interrupted before that point. The damage that has accumulated is real, but it is not permanent. With appropriate treatment and a complete cessation of the exposure, you should recover fully over the course of several months. An end to the exposure." Such a clean procedural phrase for what it signified. The Earl turned from the window. His face was the face of a man who has received confirmation of something he had half known for weeks, and is now in the first moments of understanding what to do with the confirmed knowledge. "Thank you, Hesketh," he said. "You will remain at Thornmere until the legal business is resolved." "I will," Dr. Hesketh said, and began to pack his case. The morning proceeded in the strange quiet of a house that does not yet know it has changed. Cecily returned to her room before the household stirred, removed Ellen's uniform with care, folded it and set it on the chair by the door, and dressed in her own clothes, the gray-green wool gown she had brought because it was warm and plain and would not draw attention among the more elaborate wardrobes of Lady Hargrove's usual circle. She appeared at the breakfast table at the usual hour, in the usual way, with the usual composed expression that the household had come to expect from Lady Hargrove's quiet companion, who watched everything and said little. Lady Hargrove was already at the table, addressing her toast with the comfortable thoroughness of a woman who has never doubted her right to a good breakfast and never intends to start. She remarked on the pleasant quality of the morning light, and wondered whether the weather might hold for an outing to the village. Cecily said that she believed it might. Mr. Vane arrived at the table shortly after, looking well-rested in the particular way of a man who sleeps without difficulty, because he has arranged matters to his satisfaction. He helped himself to kedgeree and coffee and addressed a series of pleasant remarks to Miss Aldwych, who had been at Thornmere for a week as a guest of the family connection, and whose presence Cecily had been considering from several angles since her arrival. Miss Aldwych was a composed, correct young woman who said the appropriate thing at the appropriate moment and who had positioned herself, over the week of her visit, as a natural and easy companion to the household. Whether she knew what Mr. Vane was doing in the butler's pantry in the late evenings, Cecily could not yet determine. Mr. Reed. Vane glanced once toward the head of the table where the Earl sat over his morning correspondence, noted some quality in his cousin's color or posture, and recalculated something behind his eyes that he then covered smoothly with a remark to Miss Aldwych about the hunting season. Then he looked at Cecily. "Miss Wren," he said, in that pleasant carrying voice that had the particular quality of a man addressing someone he has categorized and found negligible. "You look rather pale this morning. Did you not sleep well?" I imagine country houses of this size can be difficult to adjust to for those accustomed to smaller establishments. She had been waiting for this moment since she sat down. She had been waiting, specifically for the dismissal, because she had learned from her father's papers that the first useful thing a certain kind of man did when he encountered an unknown quantity was to dismiss it, and that the dismissal was always more informative than the man intended. "Quite well, thank you," she said. "I find I sleep very soundly in a clear conscience." She held his look for a second longer than was strictly comfortable, and then turned back to her own plate. "Such a shame," he said, recovering smoothly, with the comfortable finality of a man closing a subject he has already judged beneath further attention, "that provincial households cannot quite prepare young women for the demands of a great house. The hours alone must be fatiguing, simply keeping pace." Miss Aldwych murmured something in the agreeable register she used for Mr. Vane's observations. Lady Hargrove looked up from her eggs. The Earl set down his correspondence. "Miss Wren," the Earl said, and his voice was level in a way that made the quality of attention at the table shift, without any obvious reason, "keeps excellent hours, I have reason to know it." He looked at Cecily for a single moment, with an expression that was entirely opaque to anyone who was not looking for what she had been looking for, and then he returned to his letter. "Mr. Claw." Vane's coffee cup paused for a fraction of a second on its way to his mouth. The pause was small enough that it might not have been a pause at all if you were not watching for it. Cecily had been watching for it. She felt something in her chest that she took a moment to identify correctly, not because the feeling was obscure, but because she was unaccustomed to locating it in herself. It was warmth, specifically. The warmth of being defended by someone who had chosen to do so. If you have ever been the person the room decided not to see, you will know what that warmth is. Stay with it. "There is more coming, Mr." Hensley, the solicitor from York, arrived on the afternoon of the following day in a hired post-chaise, a composed man of 50, with a spare frame and the particular look of someone who has spent his professional life dealing with situations that other people have made complicated, and who has made his peace with that as a vocation. He had known Cecily's father during the years before the ordination, and he looked at her when she came to the study door to meet him with the expression of a man who had understood from the letter she had sent precisely what kind of situation he was coming into, and who had come because the letter was Cecily's, and Cecily's father had been the kind of man whose daughter you trusted. They assembled in the study, the Earl behind his desk, Cecily at the side table with her notes. Mr. Shebley, Hensley in the chair across from the Earl, Dr. Hesketh standing with his case near the window. The fire was lit against the October chill and the lamp was burning, and the room had the composed, concentrated quality of a space in which serious things were about to be spoken carefully. Mr. Vane was not told that Mr. Danvers, Hensley, had arrived. He was told only that the Earl wished to see him in the study at 4 o'clock, regarding an estate matter requiring his attention. He came in looking comfortable and certain, which was the one quality he had always had in reliable abundance. The certainty was the kind that comes from a life in which one's position has generally preceded one's character into the room and done the necessary work. He stopped when he saw the assembled company. The Earl looked at him from behind his desk with an expression Cecily had not seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was not triumph. It was the expression of a man who has arrived at a moment he did not want, and who is conducting himself through it because it must be conducted through. "Philip," he said, "James." Mr. Vane's voice had shifted very slightly. The certainty had found its first hairline. "I was not aware you had guests in the study. Mr. Hensley is not a guest," the Earl said. "He is here on a legal matter." What followed had none of the drama that fiction generally grants to moments of exposure. It was procedural and measured, and in its particular way far more decisive for being so. Mr. Hensley read from a document in his careful small hand. Dr. Hesketh described his findings, and the compound identified, and what its gradual administration would have produced. The Earl said very little. He did not raise his voice at any point. He spoke in the same level tone he used for everything, and the certainty drained from Mr. Vane's face, not all at once but in increments. The way light leaves a room in the late afternoon when no one has thought to light the lamps. At one point Mr. Vane said, with an effort at his usual careless authority, "You have brought an outsider into your confidence over your own family, James. Over someone who has been in this house since we were children." "I find that I brought," the Earl said very quietly, "the person who discovered the truth. She happened to possess more of it than my family had chosen to share with me." Cecily kept her eyes on the document in Mr. Hensley's hand. She kept her expression composed. She did not look at the Earl. Mr. Vane looked at her. His mouth did something that was not quite a sneer and not quite an appeal, and ended up being neither. "A provincial. Nobody," he said, with the desperate composure of a man reaching for a weapon that has already been taken from him. "You have built your case on the word of a provincial. Nobody. The case," Mr. Hensley said pleasantly from his chair, "is built on documented evidence, professional medical testimony, and a witness whose account is corroborated in all material particulars. Whether Miss Wren is from London or from Lincolnshire does not alter the compound in the decanter, or the effect it was designed to produce." It was the most Mr. Hensley said in the entire 2 hours of the meeting. It was, as her father used to observe, precisely enough. Mr. Vane left Thornmere Hall that evening in a hired carriage, accompanied by the Bow Street man whom Mr. Rawle. Hensley had arranged with a forethought that indicated he had expected this outcome and planned for it before he had even arrived. There was no raised voice. There was no scene. There was only the sound of wheels on the gravel of the drive, and then the silence of the house which settled back into itself like a room into which a disruptive sound has ceased. Miss Aldwych departed the following morning, her farewells to Lady Hargrove extended, and her acknowledgment of Cecily, brief and angled in a way that suggested she had a great deal she had decided not to say. The decanters in the butler's pantry were emptied, cleaned, and refilled from new stock, under the Earl's direct supervision. Hesketh left a course of treatment written in his precise casebook hand, and a list of instructions that the housekeeper, Mrs. Baird, received and studied, with the focused attention of a woman who had been waiting for something actionable. On the second morning after, Mrs. Baird met Cecily in the West Wing corridor. She stopped. She looked at Cecily with the direct, appraising gaze of a woman of 50, who has been in service at the same house for 30 years, and who is accustomed to assessing things accurately. "We knew something was wrong," she said, in a voice so low it occupied only the space between them. "I knew it. Several of us did. We did not have words for it, and we did not have recourse, and we told ourselves we were imagining what we were not imagining." She paused. Ellen knew. She did what she could with what she had. She straightened her collar. "I am glad there was someone for her to write to, miss." She walked on before Cecily could answer. Cecily stood in the corridor for a moment in the quiet, and then walked on as well. The Earl found her in the library on the third afternoon. She had arranged her father's letters on the table to confirm the order before tying them back into their bundle, and she was fitting the last of them into sequence when she heard the particular quality of the doorway behind her, a stillness that had a person in it rather than an absence. She finished what she was doing before she turned. He was better. That was the first and most immediately apparent thing. The gray beneath his eyes had lessened and his color had improved, and he moved through the doorway without the controlled economy of a man managing his own body's unreliability. He looked like a man who was beginning to understand what it felt like to be well again, which was a particular kind of look, recognizable and quiet. He looked at the letters on the table. "You are returning them," he said. "I have no further use for them here. The matter is concluded. You intend to leave with Lady Hargrove." It was not quite a question. It had the shape of an observation that is carrying a question inside it without committing to one. Lady Hargrove's visit was always of limited duration, Cecily said. Another 3 or 4 days will see it concluded. In the natural way, she tied the cord around the bundle and smoothed it. "I think the North Riding air has suited her well enough. She says so herself." "Miss Wren," he said, and stopped. He moved further into the library, not crowding her, but closer than the room's formality precisely required, and she was aware of the specific measure of air between them in a way that she did not attempt to explain to herself in clinical terms. He looked at the shelves behind her for a moment, which had belonged to his father and his grandfather, and which represented the slow, accumulated weight of a life built on something enduring. And then he looked at her. "I should like to ask you something," he said. "If you will allow it." "You may ask," she said. "When you arranged Lady Hargrove's visit, when you wrote to the apothecary in Lincoln, when you acquired the vial and the list, and constructed the position that allowed you to be in this house with any usefulness at all." He looked at her steadily, with the gray eyes that had the quality of early morning light, that has decided to stay rather than burn off. "You did all of that before you had any certainty it would come to anything. Before you had legal backing or domestic support or any assurance that the person you were coming to help was someone who deserved it. Ellen had told me what she had seen." Cecily said. "That was sufficient." "That is not quite what I am asking." He was quiet for a moment. "What I am asking is, what sustained you through the uncertainty of it? Most people in your position, by which I mean your financial position and your social position, and your position as a young woman with no authority in law to compel anything, would have written a letter to a magistrate and left the matter there." Cecily looked at the bundle of her father's letters on the table. She thought about his handwriting, which had been small and very precise, and about the evening she had read the letter in which he described the feeling of setting down a case whose outcome had not been what he had worked for, and what he had said about it. Which was that the work was the work, and the outcome was what the outcome was, and that they were not the same thing. She had no other recourse, she said. That seemed to me to be a fact that required a response, not a judgment about whether the response would succeed. She looked up at him. "My father used to say that the shape of a situation determines what a person of conscience can do about it. This situation had a particular shape. I was the person who could see it clearly. That made the question rather simple." He looked at her across the small space of the library. In the afternoon light that had worked its way through the tall windows and lay in long, pale rectangles on the floor, between them and on the shelves of his father's books, and on the table where her father's letters sat in their cord. "Cecily," he said. She had not expected her given name. She did not show that she had not expected it, but she was aware of it, the deliberateness of it, the way it landed differently than any of the Miss Wrens he had used across the past 4 days. "I am not," he said with the care of a man choosing each word at its full value, "accustomed to asking for things. I have had very little practice at it. I learned early that asking produced either its own refusal or an agreement that had a cost attached that arrived later, and I found that neither outcome suited me, and so I stopped asking in the ordinary way." He looked at the table, at the letters, at her hands resting near the cord. "What I do not wish is for you to leave Thornmere in 4 days having understood your time here only as the successful resolution of a specific practical difficulty. What I wish is not yet words." He stopped. He looked at her. "I am aware that I am handling this badly," he said with a frankness that was not self-deprecation but simply accuracy. "I would appreciate it if you did not hold that against me." "You are handling it," she said. "Rather better than you believe." Something shifted in his face. It was the particular shift of a man who has been very tightly composed for a long time and has just felt the first small relaxation of what has been holding the composure in place. And she thought, there it is. There is the man who lives below the stillness. He reached across the table and rested 3 fingers against the back of her hand. Not taking it, not pressing, simply the warm, specific weight of his hand, resting there and looking at her and not looking away. "I would not have you leave," he said. "I would have you stay. Not as Lady Hargrove's companion, and not in any instrumental or convenient capacity. As yourself, in this house, with a permanent claim to it, if that is something you would consider." He paused. "I am asking because I mean the asking, and not for any other reason. I want you to know that. The house is in order. Hesketh says I will recover fully. I am not a man drowning looking for something to hold. I am a man who has had 4 days to observe you with some care, across circumstances that are not ordinary, and who has arrived at a conclusion that appears to him to require stating rather than leaving to inference." Cecily looked at his hand on hers. She looked at his face. She thought about the cottage in Lincolnshire, and the improving sermons and the bundles of her father's letters, and Ellen's careful frightened handwriting and the apothecary's list, and the grey wool uniform folded on the chair in her room. She thought about Mrs. Baird's voice in the corridor saying, "We did not have words for it, and we did not have recourse." She thought about the long procedural patience it took to see a thing clearly when every other structure in the room was arranged to prevent you. She turned her hand over beneath his. "I believe," she said, "that staying may be arranged." His fingers closed around hers. It was not a dramatic gesture. It asked nothing more of the moment than what the moment could hold. The lamp on the table behind them burned steadily, and the afternoon light shifted another degree on the floor between them, and the library held its silence the way libraries have always held things. Carefully, and for as long as required. What remained after that was the procedural business, and it was somewhat less fraught than the preceding business had been. Mr. Torty Hensley returned from York for the second time with a lighter purpose and a smaller case, and sat across the desk from them both, and drew up the papers in his careful hand while the fire in the study burned and the first snow of the season fell in steady curtains past the window, the kind of November snow that arrives without urgency and intends to stay. Lady Hargrove received the news with a warmth, suggesting that she had suspected something of the sort for at least 2 days, and had been practicing her expression of pleasant surprise. Mrs. Baird, bringing the tea tray to the study while the papers were being reviewed, set it down on the side table and withdrew without comment and without expression, and then paused in the doorway, and looked at Cecily, and gave a single small nod that was too private to call congratulation, and too deliberate to be nothing. The papers were signed, the fire burned, the snow fell outside, and the house held itself around the sound of the pen. And the quiet, it was not a dramatic conclusion, it was a procedural one, and it was the right kind. Later, when the study had been quiet for an hour, and Mr. Hensley had gone to the guest room, and Lady Hargrove to her embroidery, the Earl and Cecily sat together in the window seat with the snow visible beyond the glass, and the lamp burning low on the table behind them. And he told her about his mother, who had been the woman in the oil painting on the mantelpiece, and about the particular loneliness of the years after, when his cousin Philip had been the only person of his own generation in the house, and he had been grateful for the company without knowing precisely what kind of company it was. He told her about the first signs of his own decline, the confusion in the evenings and the trembling hands, and the way the world had begun to feel as though it were something he was observing from a slight remove, and about the months of trying to explain it by other means, and about the morning he had risen before 5, and walked the length of the West Wing passage, and found the butler's pantry door ajar, and a figure in a grey uniform that did not fit quite right standing at the table with a candle. She told him about her father, about the shelves of papers, and the cold evenings, and the specific pleasure of reading a mind that was careful and honest and interested in the world. about the letter from Ellen and the 2 days of sitting with it, and the third morning's conclusion that there was no one else who was going to come. About the apothecary and Lincoln, who had looked at her across his counter and said he had known her father for 20 years and would help her in any way that was in his power. The Earl listened in the way of someone who is genuinely interested in what another person's life has actually been, rather than what category it fits. A provincial nobody, he said after a while quietly to himself, as much as to her. That is what he called me, she agreed. He was wrong about a considerable number of things. The Earl said. That was among the more instructive of his errors. Outside the window the snow lay over the grounds of Thornmere Hall in the dark, covering the gravel drive and the kitchen garden path and the stone wall of the formal garden and the bare trees at the edge of the east meadow. The house was quiet in the way it had not quite been since Cecily arrived. Not the quiet of a held breath, but the quiet of a room that has been set back to rights and has exhaled. She had placed her father's bundle of letters on the shelf beside the study door when they came to sign the papers. She had not moved them since. They sat there in their cord, in the lamplight, small and tidy, and entirely at home, in a library that had held his kind of careful attention for as long as it had held anything. She looked at them for a moment. She looked at the man beside her, who was watching the snow with an expression that was beginning to learn how to be at ease. She thought that quiet work in the end did not need to be loud to matter. It only needed to be done and to be seen by someone capable of seeing it, and to arrive where it was meant to arrive. The snow fell on. The lamp burned. Thornmere Hall held them both, and the morning would be there when they were ready for it.